I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. And in this episode, we are exploring the politics and evolution of disability rights with Annie Tulkin and Katherine McKay, two Montgomery County disability rights advocates. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. Disability rights is a catch-all category that includes everything from wheelchair use and deafness to ADHD and autism. The Americans with Disabilities Act was a landmark piece of legislation that made institutions responsible for accommodating persons who have a disability. The standard of accommodation often is what can be reasonably provided. And given the expense, institutions have hesitated and have had to be pushed, often in courts. The burden of proof of need and reasonable falling often at great cost on the disabled persons themselves.
Laying claim to the wasteland of a planet. There's a world on the edge of the stellar maps, left alone ever since the empire fell.
If you're new to the show, I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools, and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society functioning precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. It is my hope that this podcast will help those who feel left out reconnect in our local communities. Music for this episode comes from Bad Robot Jones, a Washington, D.C. area band of escaped androids on the run. Mixing punk, progressive, and indie rock, they play songs about assassin robots, Vulcan rituals, and the fall of galactic empires. Zach Parkman on vocals and guitar, Doogie Whittaker on bass and vocals, and Joey Jenkins on the drums. You are listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. In the news, there's a war across the world in Ukraine and a truckers' convoy trying to block the capital beltway closer to home. Here is a natural experiment I did using Facebook. I asked for help getting in touch with Ukrainians and with the truckers. I got several offers and direct links with Ukrainians even in the middle of war. But I got one offer to connect with truckers, which did not go far at all. I'm still working on those episodes, but the natural experiment was evidence to me that we know more about politics far away than we do about politics closer to home. Now, this is not true across the political spectrum and for all people across all issues. I assume there will be people on the right who know more about the politics of the truckers than they know about the politics of Ukraine. But let's not forget, the truckers' convoy in the U.S. imitates the Canadian truckers who shut down Ottawa. This week, the Montgomery County Public Schools, one of the stalwart masking organizations, dropped its mask mandate inside of school buildings, following the CDC and the state of Maryland also dropping masking requirements. Many who petitioned the Board of Education to keep the mask mandates, parents and students, were booed and jeered by anti-masking activists. Later, I spoke with Peter Witzler, who had created a petition to keep masking.
I support universal masking because of kids like my son Jackson, who are immunocompromised and at severe risk for severe complications and death from COVID-19. So universal masking can ensure that Jackson and every kid like him at MCPS is able to access a safe educational environment, and lifting that universal masking mandate then would violate the Individuals with Disabilities Act and his right to a free and appropriate education. Families like mine feel left out and left behind by the decision of the board today, and by the guidance from CDC that shifts the entire burden of keeping our loved ones safe to us and ourselves. Universal masking is about protecting everybody, and what the board said today and what the CDC said last week is that sorry, not sorry. You're on your own.
Has Jackson been in school the last year?
No, not the last year. So we did virtual schooling up until he was fully vaccinated. That was the plan. Come January, he was thrilled to go back to the in-person learning. He actually, we had those snow days, and he cried a little bit because he would have rather started school on time, than have a snow day with us. But yeah, so he's been in school since January, and he's loving it, loving every minute of it.
And what are you going to do now?
Well, that's the question, right? And that's the $1 million question. And that's what's so unfair and unkind about this whole situation is that now my family has to choose, and I don't know what we're going to choose. To knowingly send Jackson to an unsafe environment, or to risk the academic progress that he's making with the in-person learning. And we don't know. And the reality is that we don't have enough information to be able to make that decision yet. I don't know if anybody's ever tried to schedule an appointment with a specialist, especially a pediatric pulmonologist, to be able to have a conversation with them about, okay, well, now that masking has lifted, is it safe to send Jackson to school? And we haven't had time to be able to get that appointment scheduled yet. I just had a conversation with Jackson's principal, and she was just as surprised as me and is trying to figure out the plan right now. Him returning to school originally was contingent on him and his peers being masked. So that was the medical advice that we have followed, and our family follows the science.
Have you talked to Jackson?
Yeah, he's here in the car with me now. We're driving back from Philadelphia. We were up at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia to have a visit with one of his specialists up there that had been planned for a while to evaluate when and if it's time for what will be his 5th spinal surgery. And, that's going to be happening in the next 4 to 5 months, 4 to 6 months, maybe. So, that's another reason why it's so important to keep Jackson safe and healthy, is that, delaying this surgery because of contracting COVID from one of his unmasked peers at school could have real and serious impacts right away from COVID, and can have real and serious long-term impacts on his health and ability to live independently as an adult. These are the choices that parents like me make every day to keep our kids safe.
Peter Witzler, Jackson, have a safe drive back. Hopefully the decision makes sense.
All right. Thank you, Sunil.
What is clear in the political battle over masking is that the individualist position on masking, that is, someone could wear a mask if they wanted to, has won against the communitarian perspective, where masking was seen not only as an act to protect yourself, but also to protect others. The mask debate, and before that the school building reopening debate, have overshadowed what used to be the bread and butter of education politics, budgets. At a time when the state's coffers are burgeoning, more money is expected to flow from the blueprint for Maryland's future legislation. There is federal COVID relief money available. Local income taxes are expected to be high, and property taxes are expected to rise in the future. The Montgomery County government has proposed that almost $190 million in capital spending be put off for the out years of the county's 6-year capital spending plan, resulting in pushing back several critical school projects. The Board of Education has asked for $130 million, or about 5% above the state law mandated legal minimum for its operational budget. This law is often called the Maintenance of Effort Law. The increase looks larger because MCPS has lost 5,000 to 6,000 students, which lowered the baseline itself by about $100 million. The county executive is expected to propose his budget next week, and we will be following closely. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. I'll be back with disability rights activists Annie Tulkin and Katherine McKay. Annie Tulkin is the founder of Accessible College, a firm that helps with college preparation and transition help for students with physical and mental health conditions. Katherine McKay sometimes uses a cane to walk and has difficulty using stairs. Both advocate to make our physical infrastructure easier to use by disabled persons, including ensuring compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Annie Tulkin, Katherine McKay, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you. Glad to be here.
My image of disability rights goes back to when the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. And we saw pictures of amputees crawling up the steps of Congress. How has disability rights evolved, changed since then?
The evolution of kind of the disability rights movement has been really interesting in the last several years, especially since a lot more has gone online, right? And so when we're looking at kind of social media as a way to connect and join people with disabilities, that's been huge. There's a whole hashtag disability Twitter. There's a lot of kind of more focus on voting and voting rights and people with disabilities mobilizing for elections. There's a hashtag Crip the Vote, which is a fantastic thing for people to check out and follow. And the disability rights organizations like the American Association of People with Disabilities and NICL, the National Council on Independent Living, have been super active in kind of getting people on the same page and activating them. So that's been, I think the social media kind of experience has been huge in terms of supporting people with disabilities and creating a space for people to get together and share ideas and mobilize. So that's been a really big shift. In terms of how like the passage of the ADA has changed things, it was just the 31st anniversary of the passage of the ADA in July. And yes, I think most people would say things have changed, right? And we have, we have curb cuts so that people with wheelchairs can get up. We have more of an understanding about programmatic compliance and making things accessible and providing support, but there's still a long way to go, right? So the ADA itself kind of relies on people to complain and to threaten lawsuits and to go through with lawsuits. The whole law is kind of built that way, and so there's a lot more that needs to be done in terms of physical and kind of programmatic accessibility for people.
So a long way to go. Can you give me some examples of where we need to go and how long the road is? Katherine, you want to take that?
So Annie brought up the excellent point that the burden is on individuals with the Americans with Disabilities Act, as it so often is with our civil rights laws. And that means that if you hit a wall when you ask someone to make a change that is required under the law, your options are usually to contact an elected official and just hope it wasn't a public agency causing the problem in the first place, or try to find a lawyer. If your case does not deal with employment discrimination, it is very, very hard to find a lawyer. I have tried. Even using every resource that both our electeds and the lawyers I know could point at me. So that is one of the big places that is left to go. We passed this incredible landmark law. And as you said, it took folks crawling up the Capitol steps, but there was not a provision in that law to, for example, require public institutions to come into compliance with it in a certain amount of time. So the work has been getting done, I think, over the past 3 decades in a way that's less visible, in that it is lots of individualized efforts to make our society more accessible. And then I also think if you want to update that iconic image, think about the fight to save the Affordable Care Act back in 2017. The people who really made a difference in that were not only the Medicare for All advocates, but also disabled advocates who were in offices, who were getting arrested in the halls of Congress, who were making sure that this could not be off of the agenda of any sitting lawmaker. And I think, the images of people in wheelchairs being dragged out of them by Capitol Police officers to be shoved into custody really kind of make the point that we've come a long way, but we have not come far enough. Now we can get inside the building, but symbolically, it's still very difficult to win change.
How does this burden on the individual to prove challenge manifest in our local built environment in Montgomery County, or if you will, the Washington, D.C. region? Where are the failures? What are your challenges?
I think for a lot of people with disabilities, whether they're visible disabilities like a physical disability or an invisible disability like a cognitive disability or a mental health condition or a chronic health condition, a lot of people suffer from kind of advocacy fatigue because you're constantly having to point out an issue and re-advocate and re-advocate. A classic example of this is in Montgomery County, we have kind of loosey-goosey perimeters around construction sites, right? So we'll use this example as sidewalks and construction sites and blocking of sidewalks. And honestly, Sunil, I could go around Silver Spring and encounter the same problem like a block apart over and over again. And then you constantly have to report it. So you're calling 311 or you're connecting with your council member. And I could spend my entire life. I could make a full-time plus job out of walking around, even in just downtown Silver Spring or here where I live in Long Branch, and just notifying people of the ADA compliance related issues. And that is a burden.
The county's pedestrian master plan is supposed to do some of this. Can you speak to what the master plan is and what it is supposed to do?
One of the things that has come out of the planning for the pedestrian master plan is level of comfort. The county has done a level of comfort map for streets where people are self-reporting how they feel navigating sidewalks and spaces in their communities across Montgomery County. Anybody can go and check it out on the website. And that's been really revelatory, I think, for people to see how people feel about, navigating that street space or streetscape. But what the pedestrian master plan will do is, it's already identifying some of the places that absolutely need help. There are some spaces where, pedestrians are relegated to tiny little paths, unpaved paths, and just inaccessible spaces. This isn't just for people with disabilities. It's also people who use strollers, people with limited mobility, grandma and grandpa, somebody who uses crutches, somebody who uses a mobility device, even for a temporary injury. So hopefully the pedestrian master plan will provide guidance. This will give us a template. It'll give us something to go with to then say, how can we actually create change?
Katherine?
So I think Annie hit on a lot of the most important things. One thing I would note around sidewalks is that we have money in our budget to pave about 4 miles of new sidewalks per year. 4 miles in our enormous county with more than 1 million people, where there are many older spaces that have no sidewalks, particularly in lower income neighborhoods. That is often where you see the most serious off of the main roads pedestrian and cyclist injury, because there are just no safe places to be if you're not in a car. So really focusing on getting sidewalks in place in low-income neighborhoods and racially segregated neighborhoods, I think would be a really important top priority there, as well as actually planning for the costs of moving infrastructure out of our public right-of-ways, because that is expensive, and it is something that will only happen if there is a clear mandate to do it within our county's policymaking structure. So those are two things. I did also, though, want to return back to that point around the challenges of having a local Department of Transportation and a state Department of Transportation with shared responsibilities. While the pedestrian master plan cannot accomplish this, I think that one of the most important things that we can do as Marylanders is work to make the state highway administration more friendly to people who aren't in cars. They do not respond to reports about accessibility threats, like major accessibility threats on state roads. They just don't respond. Their form is extremely difficult to use on your phone. So you have to remember and make a note to go do it at home later. And there's just, even more barriers. I don't even know if the site is accessible to people with screen readers. That is really a central challenge, given that agency has jurisdiction over any sidewalk on a state road, which is why those sidewalks are in far worse repair. And then finally, I do want to also just mention that this is, again, not in the pedestrian master plan, but prioritizing not just the ability to be in public, but the ability to exist in an independent and dignified way. And that requires a lot more local, state, and federal spending and priorities. Disabled people who don't work almost universally live in poverty. Our disability benefits are below the poverty line, and they have been for a really long time. That was one of the first disability advocacy issues I was exposed to professionally way back in 2010. And while ABLE accounts are now a law, there hasn't been any progress on that front, and it's major. And then for working disabled people like myself, we tend to spend almost like 25% of our take-home pay on out-of-pocket medical costs. That's a lot. That is a lot of money. It is money that prevented me from buying a house for many years. It is money that is going to be measured in retirement security or insecurity. And it is money that, really gets in the way of pursuing your life goals and being able to live that independent and dignified existence. So while the local physical access issues are really important, I don't want us to lose sight of those bigger issues too.
So it seems like more sidewalks and clear sidewalks are priority number one, at least at the local level. I was surprised to learn that, only 4 miles of sidewalks are funded every year in the budget, which probably explains why my neighborhood is waiting for a sidewalk for 7 years.
So Neil, that's you and like several hundred people who are in the waiting line for sidewalks.
Yeah, I bet it seems that the problem is a budgetary one at the county level and perhaps even the state level. Not that I want you to go find the money, but do you have any ideas about, how that money could be secured in order to be able to build these sidewalks across the county? It is an expensive proposition. Is there infrastructure money, or should we raise taxes?
Yes and yes. Yes, we should raise taxes to pay for an accessible society. I think that for things like infrastructure, we already fund a lot of that through bond issues, and we should consider potential ways to do that to make upgrades that provide greater accessibility. Another thing that we can do is simply mandate that in a more robust way for commercial spaces and private spaces.
That's interesting, because both of you have also asked for more housing in Montgomery County. And one of the reasons why we have a shortage of housing in Montgomery County is because the construction costs here are too high. And now if you're asking for more mandates on various things, that'll even take the construction costs higher, and you might end up losing housing, and that would have an even greater negative impact on the lives of disabled people.
There's a lot you can do without saying every new house has to be built with ramps and elevators, and all of that. The building that I moved into in 2016 in downtown Silver Spring had been, it was a historic building renovation with a new construction on top of it. It took me more than 2 years of work to get an automatic push button door installed to the front door. This thing was constructed in 2013, 2014. There is no reason that that should be allowed. And I could not get a lawyer. I tried for about a year. I asked a lot of people for help, and there's just not support for that. And that was my option. Thankfully, we ended up having a new building manager who had a disabled sister. And when I went to her and was like, please help, here's what happened for the last year and change, she was like, okay, let's get it done. And it still took her another year, but she did. And that just is kind of ridiculous. You can mandate things around, particularly like renovations and upgrades. That automatic door issue would solve many people's problems. It would solve a lot of problems for a lot of people. There are no push button doors on Ellsworth Drive's pedestrian wall except at the movie theater. And that's not how it should work, given that every single one of those storefronts has had some sort of upgrades in the not quite a decade that I've lived here.
Sunil, this is Annie, chiming in to say that I think part of this is that we need to we need to switch the way that we think about these issues. It's not like we're just renovating spaces or creating spaces that are just for wheelchairs or just for, grandma and her walker. This is about creating environments and spaces for all people. And you mentioned the housing issues, and I always have to chuckle because I think there are a lot of older people who are kind of against building new housing in Montgomery County. My parents are almost 80. We are trying to transition them into new housing, a condo, an apartment setting, something that's less maintenance for them. And man, it is hard to find spaces that are accessible for them in their 80s. I don't know where some of these people think that they're going to be living if they intend to stay in Montgomery County. They're probably not going to stay in their giant houses, right? And so we need to be thinking about how are we going to be supporting people through the lifespan, right? Regardless of ability. And so if we're not thinking about that now, which we haven't been, and we're in a housing crisis, we should be thinking about it for the future. And yeah, there are funding implications, but it's an investment now for the future, but also changing people's ideas about disability in general, right? So part of this is hearts and minds of getting people to think about, getting that construction worker to say like, oh, should I put this bollard here blocking this section of sidewalk, or could I place it elsewhere so that someone could actually traverse this space? Part of it is just raising public awareness about, the needs. I see those Lime scooters everywhere in the middle of the sidewalks. It kills me. I walk up and I put them on the side, and Lime has actually done a whole campaign around like where to properly park your Lime scooter or your Lime bike or whatever. People don't think about those things as being obstacles, except people who confront them, and they are obstacles to those people. And so part of it is just raising public awareness about these issues. And hopefully that's what we're doing right now.
You spoke of sidewalks almost as a more broader pedestrian issue rather than a narrow disability rights issue. And you've both spoken about housing more generally. So our democratic system is based on coalitions. What are the kinds of coalitions that exist that bring this agenda forward, both disability rights with others?
One thing that we're seeing a lot more of now is pedestrian bike activism and disability activists coming together. There's a great example of this in Washington State, where there is a group called Rooted in Rights that has been doing a lot of work between bike and pedestrian activism and disability rights activism. And they have an amazing series of videos that anybody can check out on built environment issues in Washington State. And all of that is applicable to our area as well. So there are those types of coalitions. Also, you see a lot of groups like, AARP and other groups kind of getting involved with kind of national and local disability rights groups coming together on issues based. One of the challenges, though, that people with disabilities often confront is that, number one, a lot of people with disabilities don't think about themselves as having a disability. So that's an obstacle. There are lots of people who have conditions that are disabilities under the kind of definition in the Americans with Disabilities Act, but they might not think of themselves as having a disability. Elderly people are a classic example of this, right? So they just think like, I'm losing my hearing. I'm not, I don't have like a hearing impairment. I'm just, or like, I'm not able to walk as well as I could. But they don't think of themselves as physically disabled. And so I think part of this too is raising that awareness that this is more than just people who identify as having disabilities, but it's lots of people.
Katherine?
Some of the most important coalitions are coalitions of people who are leading different type of rights advocacy work that relate to their own identities that get into those intersections. Like, there are incredible ties and long existing ties between civil rights movements for Black and other people of color in the country and disabled and disability advocates. That is also true of voting rights and like healthcare spaces. That also is often the case. One thing that I think we are really kind of seeing more of is unusual coalitions emerging through online activism. Sometimes that gets a bad rap, but so much disability activism is organized through like Twitter and Facebook. And that is valid. And it means that you can have millions of more people engaged who otherwise would really struggle to engage with in-person activism and other types of things. Locally, I think that there are a lot of important and as yet not fully realized opportunities for effective partnership between our transit advocates and disabled advocates, and also housing. The truth is that most of the cost of housing is the land and the regulations. And adding ramps and adding requirements around like, hey, if it's multifamily with multiple floors, at least every unit on the ground floor should be fully accessible. It doesn't always have to mean putting in an elevator, but people get so stuck on like that scenario that, you hear it a lot in affordable housing circles. And it's a place where we could accomplish a lot together. Because disabled folks have an interest in lots more housing being built. Anything built in this day and age is at least more accessible than, older housing. We also have big interests in affordable housing in general and the funding for that specifically because so many of us are eligible for housing support due to our low incomes.
One of the things I've been wondering about is how physical disability rights have fared in an era where we have talked more and more about mental health or invisible disability, as I think one of you said.
So, my disabilities are physical, but also invisible, unless I am like actively using a mobility aid. And I think that it can be easier now to have kind of some understanding around what it means to be disabled in a way that someone else can't see or automatically pick up on when they look at me or talk to me. But at the same time, like progress on both has been very, very slow. The pendulum has kind of swung away from, like actually providing public accommodations, as terrible as institutionalization was, when we abolished those institutional settings for disabled folks, lots of whom were cognitively and had cognitive disabilities and mental health struggles as opposed to strictly physical disabilities. We just didn't do anything. And that created incredible needs over the last several decades. So it is good to see that pendulum swing back towards both recognizing and prioritizing a different set of, or a wider set, I should say, of disability needs. One thing I think will be a game changer is the aftermath of the pandemic. When we finally do emerge from this thing, we are going to have millions of Americans with long COVID and, who may or may not identify as disabled, but who will struggle in daily life, which is the baseline definition of having a disability, on a regular basis because of that experience. And I think there will be a lot of additional an ongoing need for support. And that actually encompasses both physical and mental disabilities for a lot of folks coming out of it.
What do you think was the effect of COVID on the disability rights movement?
Yeah, so I think, COVID did provide a lot of proof that we can change and also opportunities to make changes permanent. And here in Montgomery County, virtually every government office and agency plans to continue offering virtual participation options. And that is a huge win. It is just not possible as a person who cannot drive without a great deal of pain to go to Rockville after work, after my wife gets home with our one car. Getting from Silver Spring to Rockville without a car is really not easy. And especially if you're traveling at off-peak times, like leaving at 6 or 6:30 for a 7 o'clock meeting that will be over at 9 or 9:30.
Annie?
I think it's going to be interesting to see which of these things kind of carry over for the long term. Like when we think about, workplace accessibility, right? One of the accommodations that people with disabilities may have requested in the past was the ability to work from home. And COVID proved for many people that can be done, right? And that has impacts in other areas, environmental, transit impacts. Like there are lots of positive benefits to incentivizing people to be able to work from home if they're in a position that they can do that. And for people with disabilities, that opened up a lot of doors too, because if you have a physical disability and you rely on outside care to help you get ready for work in the morning, you're paying for that outside care. And then you actually have to get to your workplace, which, as we've pointed out, can be challenging if you're using public transit or if you're relying on paratransit. So in some ways, it's made things more accessible. It's kind of TBD on whether or not employers are going to continue to allow people with disabilities, to work from home or to work remotely. And so the same thing kind of is, I work with students who are going into college or who are in college. And so the same thing around education too. For many people, I work with students with chronic health conditions. And for a lot of students with chronic health conditions, they were like, this was the best. Like I didn't have to worry about like getting ready and getting myself to that classroom. I could just tune in and do my classwork and stay on top of things.
Katherine McKay, Annie Tulkin, thank you for coming on I Hate Politics. I hope you'll come back and tell us we made progress.
Check back in.
Yeah, I would love to come back and tell you we've made progress. So here's to that.
Lost in a celestial field. Where did the others go? Where did our brothers go? When did we lose our will? An empire led to win.
What lessons can we draw from my conversation with disability activists Katherine McKay and Annie Tulkin? First, that disability is many, many things, not one. One consequence is that the law that governs disability accommodations, the Americans with Disabilities Act, does not function like the tax code or the criminal code, which provide detailed standards and remedies. The accommodation for someone who uses a wheelchair could be different from someone who has a mental health condition. This has left disabled persons having to fight for accommodations on a case-by-case basis, often in the courts. But as Katherine McKay points out, it is almost impossible to get a lawyer for anything else other than employment discrimination cases. I would add here that there is a legal subspecialty now focusing on disability discrimination in public schools. But how to get an apartment building to install a push-button door? That's really hard. The other consequence of disability being many things is that disability rights groups tend to form around specific disabilities. And then those groups need to come together to form coalitions to become effective lobbyists for all their members. Annie Tulkin points out that disability rights and aging rights look awfully similar, and allying with AARP, the behemoth membership group of older Americans, should add new strength to the disability movement. But it is a coalition. It has to be managed in order to be effective. Second, one response to this problem of disability, as many things, has been the development of this concept called universal design that takes into account several disability issues intentionally at the planning stage when it is, in fact, cheapest to fix. I'm hoping to do an entire episode around universal design, so stay tuned. Third, it seems that for the disability community, COVID was an opportunity as much as it was a crisis. COVID pushed governments and social organizations to hold online meetings. After 2 decades of flirting with telework, employers finally accepted that work from home was not just a possibility, but perhaps cheaper and more productive. These 2 changes alone have taken big pressures off disabled persons and given them a new voice. That's all for this episode. You've been listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. Music for this episode comes from Bad Robot Jones, a Washington, D.C. area band of escaped androids on the run. Mixing punk, progressive, and indie rock, they play songs about assassin robots, Vulcan rituals, and the fall of galactic empires. Zach Parkman on vocals and guitar, Doogie Whittaker on bass and vocals, and Joey Jenkins on drums. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at ihppod@gmail.com or reach out on Twitter at ihppod. I hope you'll subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and your home. See you next time.